Hi friends, this is Taimur. Welcome to my channel, The Cloud Security Guy. In case you're new here, I talk on a weekly basis about things like cloud security, artificial intelligence, and general cybersecurity career advice. So today this is the last of our CCSP domains. So basically, if you've been following, I've been covering the CCSP domains, which is completely free crash course on the CCSP examination, which is the Certified Cloud Security Professional, one of the most popular cloud security certifications in the world right now, and it's made by the same people who made the CISSP. So the whole point of this was to completely go over all of the domains. So we've covered domains 1 to 5. Today we're going to be covering the last domain, which is domain 6. And of course, the disclaimer I always give before you move ahead: this is a crash course, this is a revision, and this is for clearing up your concepts only, because it's always good to have a revision. If you have not done anything else, like you've not read the book, you've not practiced the questions, this my small little course will not make you magically pass the examination. Please do everything, do this course and do the practice questions, read the books also, clear up all your concepts, and definitely you will pass the CCSP. And before we move ahead, guys, please do like and subscribe to this channel. This will really help the channel to grow and reach the maximum number of people. So before we start, the CCSP, as I've discussed earlier, it has 6 domains, right? You can think of these as the 6 subjects that you must master in order to pass the examination. And the CCD, these are the weightage. Today we're going to be discussing legal risk and compliance, which is the last domain. It accounts for approximately 13% and focuses mainly on the legal and regulatory requirements that pertain to cloud, okay? Because cloud computing environments, by their nature, they extend across national borders, and they can have different jurisdictions, different regulations. And you can picture one big cloud that's over 3 different countries, right? Each country has its own regulation. And within that country, there are different states or jurisdictions, and you can have different industries, banking, healthcare, on and on and on. So you have to cover everything, right? And it can become very challenging. So this is how you have to think about that. And like domain 6, like this is basically another thing which covers is e-discovery, which is like if something happens, how do you get data for digital forensics and how to provide that. As a CCSP, have to be aware of these things, and you have to know how to basically explain this. And these are the topics that will get covered. Some people think that domain 6 is a very dry topic, which I don't agree with. I think it's just less technical, but it is definitely required in order to be a proper cloud security professional. So let's start with the first topic, which is articulating legal requirements and risk within the cloud. Like I said earlier, clouds, they span numerous regions across multiple jurisdictions and countries, right? And you have to know which legislations apply to the environment, and also the technical complexities that come in when you have to collect data from those regions. Okay, so like I talked about, you can have conflicting internal regulation. Security, like I've always said, it follows the data, right? And regulations also follow the data. So the law and regulations that apply to your data are largely impacted by way that data travels, right? In general, US data centers, they have to apply to US laws, right? German data centers, they have to apply to German laws and applicable EU-wide legislation, right? And when it gets tricky is when data moves from the US to to Germany, to Singapore, to India. Like it's a good thing that cloud have data centers all across the world, because that's one of the benefits of it. But it can be a nightmare to track all the places and understand the impact of that from a legal perspective. So these are the things you really have to take to understand. As a CCSP, you should work with your organization's legal and policy teams to understand how to best treat things like data protection, copyright laws across these international boundaries. Okay. So, what are the legal risks in cloud computing? Well, the first one would be jurisdictions. So, most cloud providers, they have jurisdictions that they're governed by, right? And they're bound by the laws of the country in which they are. From a legal perspective, this usually means that the laws and regulations of the CSP's home country, they get the final say whenever some issue happens, right? And customers using cloud services from a CSP outside of their country, usually they want these clauses to be modified so that they move legal jurisdiction to the customer's home country. So large CSPs are usually able to accommodate these type of requests. Smaller providers, they're not able to do so, and they say we cannot comply with these things, or we have to look at it on a case by case basis. So you really have to understand from when you are choosing a particular cloud provider, what are these jurisdictions and which are the ones you're required to comply with. The next one, which is related to that, is data location. So data location comes up a lot and is worth mentioning here. So it should be expected, right? Unless you know something else, that a cloud provider, it permits customer data to be stored and processed at any of the data center locations, right? And In other, if your SLAs or other contractual agreements don't prohibit it, like don't prohibit the cloud provider from maintaining your data across multiple locations, it's going to be probably going to happen that your data is going to be moved from multiple locations. And usually the reason they do that is for availability redundancy, right? You want to make sure that your data is spread across, and like it doesn't, if one data center goes down, it doesn't get impacted, but it becomes a major legal risk for customers. They might have export control, right, or other data residency requirements, so you can get fined very seriously if you don't know about it. The last one is secure. The third one is security and privacy, which is one of the biggest legal risks, right? And associated with cloud environments, because the customer is relying on the CSP to maintain the security and privacy of the data. You remember we mentioned the shared responsibility model. So last thing a customer wants is to do everything right on their end and find out that the cloud provider is a weak link, right? And most cloud providers usually they provide best practices, right? Because they have so big budgets, they're certified to PCI, ISO, HIPAA, whatever you want. They are certified to this, but it's something you have to take into account. And similarly, privacy is also a huge issue, right? Because when you're moving your data to a trusted third party, you want to make sure that it's being used and processed only for intended purposes. So you have to get those requirements from the cloud providers that they're only going to use the data for which you have explicitly said they're not going to sell that data onwards. And you really have to be understand it as a CCSP. Like most countries, they have data breach disclosures, right? So moving on to the next one, which is the data breach. Most countries, they have these requirements that if there is a data breach, they have to be informed within 72 hours, within 24 hours, and you need to put those things in the SLAs, right? That the cloud provider will have to inform you immediately if something happens, if some issue happens and some breaches happen, they have to be informed. Next one is intellectual property. This is more on the data ownership. So basically, copyright, trademark, and intellectual property laws differ from one country to another. And customers who are storing sensitive IP in the cloud, they must ensure that the cloud provider is protecting their IP in compliance with the country's regulations. So, and the cloud contracts, they should explicitly state that the customer's data remains their property, even when it moved to the cloud. And so you have to make sure that all those contractual requirements are there. And okay, so moving on to the legal framework, which is the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, the number of security and privacy laws and regulations around the world, every year they continue to grow. And as a result, various frameworks and guidelines are now available to help cloud providers, build and manage their security programs in a compliant manner. And most of them are like country specific, but there are other organizations like ISO, they publish standards. Now, we've already covered a lot of them earlier, but the NIST cybersecurity framework, because NIST usually issues publications that are heavily relied on by the US government agencies and partners, and they provide security and privacy guidelines that are aimed at the private sector. So this cybersecurity framework is divided into 5 functions to help organizations, assess and build their security capabilities. You have identify. This helps you identify what your assets are. Protecting is where you implement your controls, right? To limit you, so you can limit or contain the impact of potential security threats. Detect, uh, like the name says, it's the set of detective controls that can help you discover and respond to security incidents. The next one is respond, taking appropriate action. Recovery, so last one. So these are the ones you really need to take into account. And the other ones like e-discovery. Now, e-discovery is a very important topic. It's the process of electronic data being collected, secured, and analyzed as a part of a civil or a criminal legal case. It's usually associated with lawsuits, government investigations, and other legal proceedings. And over there, electronic evidence plays a very important role. So the electronic discovery reference model, EDRM, if you've heard of that, it provides an overlooked e-discovery process. So this is not like a what I'm showing here. This is not like a step by step. It's just a high level overview. If you've ever taken a look at it, the e-discovery model, it has like these stages, right? These 5: identification, which is where you locate and tag potentially relevant digital evidence, right? Next one, very important, is preservation. You place that relevant digital evidence in a legal hold. We've discussed about that earlier. So you make sure it cannot be modified or destroyed. And this has to happen before collection. So you have to make sure that it remains intact, right? And collection is where you're gathering all the relevant digital evidence so you can review, process, and analyze them. Next one is review and analysis. This is where your legal counsel typically gets involved and evaluate what you've collected. Okay. Production. Digital evidence is delivered to the external parties such as counsel or requesting authority in the agreed upon format and whatever means they agreed upon. And whenever your organizations, usually when they receive a e-discovery request, it's a very stressful time for everyone involved. And just remember, e-discovery is not simply a digital forensics function, it's a legal matter. And you as a CCSP, you have to know which laws and statutes are applicable to your organization. But do not forget to keep your legal team, everybody involved, right? And as you develop more, you'll understand this. It's a very, very complex topic. You have to really take into account. And apart from this EDRM, ISO, Cloud Security Alliance, they also provide frameworks and guidelines for helping it. And we're going to discuss this in the coming sections. Okay. So this one I talked about ISO, right? This is another standard, and which they have, and this is focused. ISO ISC 27005, it is squarely focused on concepts related to e-discovery. So basically, it attempts to create an international standard for electronic discovery, terminology, and processes. So it's pretty much the same as the previous one, and it establishes common expectations for each step. And it also, identifies other standards in this document you see. But basically, this is like a internationally recognized standard. So they've stepped up to provide leadership here. And if you are like serious about e-discovery, this provides a great starting point for cloud service providers and cloud customers to understanding, engage with each other on e-discovery matters. Okay, next up is the Cloud Security Alliance. They published their guidance. I've talked about this earlier also in other videos. The Cloud Security Guidance, Security Guidance, okay? And among other topics, the publication also covers legal issues, contracts, and electronic discovery. I think we discussed this earlier in Domain 3, but it identifies cloud-specific issues and how you should do e-discovery, and it makes recommendations to cloud providers and customers to ensure that e-discovery are effective and compliant with regulations. So but a few things you need to understand, the terms which I've mentioned here. First one is the responding party. The responding party is basically the person group who has received an e-discovery order, and they are responsible for providing digital evidence. The requesting party is the one who is obviously, they don't have the digital evidence, but they're initiating the request to make sure they get it. Possession, custody, and control of, which I mentioned here. Basically, the United States Federal Rules of Service Procedures, they specify that the items under the responding party's possession or control must be produced to the requesting party, and they have specific rules. In a cloud environment where the responding party usually is a cloud customer, you don't physically possess or control the systems or data, right? Even if you don't have it, you still are not excused from the responsibility. So that's why it's so important for cloud providers and cloud customers, they agree upon what data is available and not available, so that if you get an order, you're able to comply with it. And next one is the cooperation and communication between the CSC and the customer. Because of the cloud customers' reliance on the cloud provider to help solve e-discovery orders, so it's in everyone's best interest that the CSP and the customer work together to resolve any such request, right? You must have proper communication set up. SLAs must be there to make sure that if any issues happen, you can quickly respond. And the last one is responding to subpoenas or search warrants. If the CSP it receives a subpoena or search warrant on behalf of customer, it has to make sure that the request is legitimate and lawful, right? Otherwise, and then it must be natural. You have to take quick action, right? Because this is a legal order. And however, the cloud provider should first give the customer notice of the legal request, because the customer should also be kept into mind, right? That they're receiving a legal order from law enforcement. So all those things you have to keep into account. As a CCSP, these are the things you have to take into account, how it changes. On-prem is easy, right? On-prem, everything you have control. But here, the things are changing. Okay, now we've covered that. Let's move on to understanding privacy issues. Now, privacy, it basically entails limiting access to personal information to authorized parties for authorized users, right? Privacy is basically you maintaining the confidentiality of personal information. And as more of our personal data moves online to the cloud, privacy is one of the biggest security related topics for every cloud provider, right? You can see, right, every time you download an app on your phone, you get all those notifications coming. And privacy is like as important as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There are many important laws which are there. As a CCSP, you have to be familiar with those laws and understand how they can impact you. Now, contractual data versus regulated private data. Now, private data, let's take a look at private data. Like PII, it's often subject to some combination of contractual and regulatory requirements. So while the source may be different, maybe contractual, maybe regulatory, either way, the cloud provider has to take it very seriously, right? Because they're required either by contractual agreement or by the law. So you have to make sure they have mature auditing capabilities present there, right? So they can report on the compliance with privacy. It's a top concern for many customers. So you have to make sure that you have like those controls probably there. So in the contractual way, in the contractual one, the first one, the contractual private data, the customer usually they want this assurance. So what they do is they put specific requirements on handling and protection of PII. So they may put like in the clause who can access it, who cannot do it, what sort of controls were there, like some stuff encryption. And if the cloud provider does not uphold this, what can happen is they can lead to contract penalties, which they may by fine. And the second one is regulated private data. So certain types of private data, like I don't know, medical data, they have to be protected by numerous laws and regulations. And regulated private data must be protected whether the customer is said or not. You have to protect it, right? Like protected health information, like I mentioned. So various industries like healthcare and all that, you have to protect it. It doesn't matter if the customer has it said or not. And if you don't do it, you can lead to steep financial penalties, even criminal charges. That's how important it is. So let's take a look at, globally, you have a lot of laws and regulations to keep with. And principles of most privacy regulations are very similar, but the specifics and the details, they vary from one jurisdiction to the next. So in this section, I want to cover some of the most prominent regulations, from the United States, Canada, European Union, and all that. So let's take a look. So United States. So United States, funnily enough, it does not have a single federal law that governs data privacy for all PII. Instead, you have multiple federal laws which are governing privacy for specific types of data in industries. Two of the most common are HIPAA and GLBA. HIPAA, if you must have heard it, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It was passed in 1996. Basically, it establishes the minimum standards for the patient's privacy and make sure that health information, only specific people you can do it, and it's only permitted to be used for the purpose of performing health related services, right? And you have to make sure that security is there. The Graham Leach Bealey Act, or GLBA, is also known as the financial, it's most on financial institutions to safeguard customers' PII. You have to make sure that you have proper security, a privacy notice is there, what data has been collected, and you have put in security controls. So I hope you understood what I'm talking about. So there are other laws also. There's no single unifying law. And in Canada, I believe you have the Canadian Digital Privacy Act. It was in 2015, I think it got published. It was a major update to earlier laws which they have. And similarly, it covers, the collection, use, and disclosure of PII across of all commercial activities. So you have to make sure you have proper security controls, encryption is there, passwords are there, and if you don't comply, you can get fined up to $100,000. So it's no joke. And lastly, the European Union, which is probably the thing which people think about the most when you talk about privacy. EU has some of the most strictest privacy laws anywhere on the planet. Many of these regulations, they even prohibit personal data from seeing outside the boundaries of the EU or a country, right? And this can be very challenging for large clouds to manage. Sometimes the EU, they can waive it for cloud providers that demonstrate like they have applicable security, right? And the mother of all privacy regulations, it was established in 2016, right? The GDPR. It went into effect in 2019. It's considered to be one of the most like strongest laws across the world. So if you store or process PII or EU citizen data, then GDPR applies it to you, even if you're not like within the EU, it can still pay out. And they have, like as you can see on the screen here, they have 7 principles for processing personal data. Lawfulness, fairness. Basically, you have to process the data in accordance with the laws, and you have to inform the customer. You have to be transparent about how the data will be used. And purpose limitation, which is you can only use it for the purpose of which you collected it, right? So you have to do what you say you're going to do and nothing more. Data minimization is you collect and process only as much data as absolutely necessary. Accuracy, you have to make sure that the data is kept accurate, right? Storage limitation, store it only as long as you need it and no more. Integrity and confidentiality, this is where security comes in. You have to make sure nobody can unauthorized access and nobody can change it. And accountability. So the data controller, that is the person or the organization that handles the personal data, usually the cloud customer, it must be able to demonstrate compliance with all of these principles. So I hope you understood, guys. And apart from that, they have other principles also, which are very important, like the right to be forgotten. So if the person says, I want my personal data to be deleted, I won't not go into the detail, but this is one of the major requirements. Like you have to really have to have strong data deletion policies to make sure you can delete this data. Okay. And another important thing is data protection by design and by default, which is a very good control. Basically, this mandate specifies that you have to make sure that privacy is there and data protection is there by design, not it's not put in afterwards. Okay. And lastly, data breach notifications. very, very important thing which requires the data controllers, they notify authorities within 72 hours of a data breach. And I've seen this in many companies. Just because you're not able to enforce it, you can get pulled into potential data breaches and be subject to serious fines. So you should be, as a CCSP, be very familiar with GDPR requirements and how it's changed privacy across the cloud computing industry. Other countries are also there, like Brazil, China, Russia. I'm not going to go into too many details of this because you can take a look at it yourself. Okay, and standard privacy requirements. So, like I mentioned earlier, you have jurisdictional differences in data privacy, right? New laws keep coming up all the time, and some have not aligned. So, some laws say that they require data retention, while GDPR says you have to delete it, right? So it can become very, very confusing. So that's why standard privacy requirements, right? It would be great to have some sort of an internationally recognized standard for guidance. So we have two here. One is 27018. It's a very new standard. It's come out basically, and it covers privacy, and the other one is the generally accepted privacy standard. So ISO 27018, like I said, it was recently updated in 2019 only, and basically it establishes a standard course of protecting PII data in public cloud, right? And you can assess the CCSP, what do you call, in your cloud computing and entering your contractual agreements, because you can show that you're compliant with this, right? So this is the ISO 27018. The next one is the generally accepted privacy principles, or the GAP, you can say. It's like a privacy framework that was established in 2009, sorry, and it was created by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. Basically, it's a framework that was initially created to assist certified public accountants in privacy, but it becomes like a very good framework you can use to help privacy, and you can use it as a CCSP also. It has around, I think, 10 privacy principles. Not going to go on all of them. It's very similar to the GDPR and ISO 27018. But just keep in mind, these are the international privacy requirements which you need to keep into account. Okay, lastly, we're going to talking about understanding the audit process and methodologies and adaptation for cloud environments. So as I highlighted throughout the book, the uniqueness and the way the cloud is different, right? So that's why it's audit is also changes in the cloud. Traditional data centers on-prem, it's easy to do, right? If you've not done any auditing if you've done any auditing, sorry, of non-cloud IT systems, then many of the concepts are going to be similar. But at the same time, every CCSP, you have to understand that in the cloud things change, and unfortunately, there are many requirements, certification, attestations that are created for legacy IT environments, and in the cloud there are very few, but slowly it's becoming very, very mature, and a lot of standards are coming up. So let's take a look at that. And audit requirements, like if you take a look at many traditional audits, that they require an auditor to visit a data center. Can you imagine if somebody has to visit that every single data center which AWS has or Azure has, how complicated that could become? So let's take a look. What are the challenges? Well, a thing which I've talked about many, many times before, it's the hypervisor, right? Other virtualization techniques. It can create a massive challenge for auditing cloud environments. Audits of traditional data centers usually start with an inventory, right? And the auditor usually checks the data center and its assets. Now, with physical data centers, could be easy, but for a large public cloud that has hundreds to thousands, even millions of assets, how can you possibly go around and try to do it manually, right? And you can do it sampling, but then sampling you will have to really, like, even 10%, you can imagine how challenging that could become, right? And at the same time, the hypervisor, you have to be looking at the hypervisor, but what about the underlying physical infrastructure? So all those things you have to take into account as an auditor, and really it changes how auditing is done compared to, say, on-prem, right? And like I mentioned earlier, the cloud auditor, it's very important for them to have a strong understanding of the virtualizing architecture, because you need to really have transparency from the cloud provider, how the virtualization is happening, how the underlying physical structure is being secured. Sometimes cloud providers won't give you the audit or won't give you the access. So you really have to have a proper understanding, have those proper contractual clauses present. And you can rely on audit reports also. Basically, an audit report will tell the cloud provider, will show to the customer, like, look, we are certified to these requirements. So I think there are three reports, the most common widely used audit report: SSAE, SOC, and ISAE. So the first one, statement on standards for attestation engagements, SSAE. So it's like a standard published in 2017, I think. and it's focused on audit methods. It imposes requirements on organizations to report on their third-party vendors' security and risk profile. So, in other words, in the cloud world, the SSAE standard requires cloud providers evaluate the organization controls to make sure that they're meeting a certain standard, right? And SSAE 18, it's intended to protect cloud customers from like unknowingly exposing their business and data to risk by partnering with a vendor that doesn't have those strong security controls, right? So these are the things you have to understand. Okay, just move on. Yeah, moving on to SOC 1 and SOC 2. So SOC 1 and SOC 2 are a like it's a very common auditing standard. There are two types of reports. The type 1 report, it focuses on the description of a service organization systems and effectiveness of its policies and procedures. And the type 2, it's the same thing, but it's evaluated over a period of time instead of a single point in time. And usually there's a evaluation of the controls also. So first one just had a documentation, second one you are evaluating the controls also, okay, for a period of time. And usually security and availability and all those things, those are covered here. Okay, so SOC type 2, it covers a lot more than just like the initial one with the 2, and it's usually the report which is used the most. Next one is the ISA, International Standards on Assurance Engagements. So this one, it's an international assurance standard that it's very similar to SSAE, and so there are a few differences, most of which is a technical nature. You don't have to go into too details, but you should know that ISA is mostly used outside of the US, whereas SSAE is primarily used within the United States. So before the cloud provider, or like we're talking about audit concepts now. Now, before a cloud provider or anybody undergoes an audit, usually they have a few things they have to take into account, right? There's something called the restrictions of audit scope statements. So these are basically restrictions of what an auditor may and may not audit. And these are important mechanisms. So you have to make sure you communicate that to the audit first. And it's entirely up to the organizations, and you have to find that balance. Cloud providers, they have to be careful not to restrict the auditor's ability to perform a thorough audit, and what do you call in usually auditors, they don't have an issue telling cloud providers if you're being too restrictive, but you have to set that balance which is there. And we'll go into the details of that audit planning and the gap analysis basically where you are and where you have to be and what you have to do. And let's take a look at audit planning when we're talking about. So audit planning, this is how audits work, this is a proper methodology. So here you define the audit objectives, what you're going to be doing. You define your audit scope, like what is the scope of the audit. You complete your audit, you review your findings, and then you find out where do you stand as of today, right? And apart from that, you have internal information security management systems also. This is basically a set of policies, procedures, and systems for effectively managing the security of like a cloud provider or any environment. It's basically a very systematic way of implementing security, right? As a CCSP, you should design and implement your organization's ISMS using like standards. And the most common one, I mean, whenever you hear ISMS, usually people think about ISO 27001, and that is pretty much the international standard which is used across the world. I think we've already discussed ISO. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Okay, so we're almost reaching the end here, and we're going to be talking about understanding implications of cloud on enterprise risk management. Okay, so like with any other IT product, like the cloud or anything you do that has an impact on your business's risk posture, right? So you have to take into account how you are understanding the risks and how your overall risk management program is looking at these risks. And especially your provider as a CCSP, anytime you use a third party to host or manage your data, you must understand the vendor's risk management programs also, right? And when your data is hosted in the cloud, it is essential that you evaluate the provider's risk policies and methodologies to determine how they align with your own risk management. So really looking to ensure that the CSP, the cloud provider, is treating your data as well as you would treat it, right? So this is where everything comes in. Sorry. Oh, sorry, my apologies. I just moved the idea. Yeah. So one of the key things that you really need to take into account with detecting the risk is understanding the roles and responsibilities, right? Many regulations and certifications, it requires that organizations identify the specific individuals or groups as data owner and data custodian. Very important if you need to pass the CCSP. Just take an so data owner or data controller. A data owner, data controller is the individual who owns the responsibility for dictating how and why the data is used and determining how the data is to be secured. So in some cases, the data owner processes the data using its own processes, right? Like the cloud. And or in other cases, it outsources that to a third party. So even when outsourcing happens, the data owner does not lose control of the data. So no matter who processes the data owner is always responsible. And the next one is data custodian or the data processor. So basically, data custodian, data processor is an individual that processes the data on behalf of the data owner. So data owner tells you this is what you want to do with that data. Like if you outsource it, right? And is responsible to the data custodian or the processor is responsible for adhering to the data owner's requirements for using and securing to data and to make sure that the data is used as exactly like the data owner said, right? So this concept has been around for many time and it really became popular with the GDPR. So just know these two requirements. Data owner is the one who is generating and dictating and owning that data. Data processor custodian is just doing what the data owner is telling him to do, right? And moving on, this is where the risk assessments come in. So a risk assessment, I think we've already talked about, and I'm sure you must be available. This is just a formal way of identifying your security risks, right? You identify them, analyze them, evaluate them, treat them. And how do you treat them? Basically, risk assessments, usually you have these sort of matrices which are there, right? It depends. You can avoid the risk by not doing the activity. You can mitigate it by putting a control. You can transfer the risk, maybe like taking insurance, or you accept the risk. So if you have a risk threshold, you might say that, okay, I'm willing to accept this risk, the issue which happened. So this is a very common concept, not going to spend too much time on that. You have many risk frameworks already available, like ISO 31000, NIST. Numerous risk frameworks exist in the IT world. I mean, these are some of the most common, although there are many available. Just be aware of them from the CCSP perspective. Okay, so the last topic we have to understand is understanding outsourcing and cloud contract design. This is very important. Design, like early on, in the cloud, people just used to outsource this to the procurement legal teams. But now, when so much data is there, so much processing is there, IT teams, security teams, everybody gets involved in this, and you should be available. So when you talk about vendor management, the rise of cloud computing, it really has a lot of attention has come to this thing, right? Because you need to really take into account, like vendor management is the process by which the organization manages risks related to vendors and ensures that effective service delivery by the vendors. Contract negotiation is there. So you have to make sure you have a IT team, security team, they know what cloud related contracts are there. As a CCSP, you have to really understand your business requirements and risk profile. You have to make sure things like SLA, uptime, compliance, all those things are there, right? Right, and you have to make sure that those things are there before the contract is signed. After the contract signs, it becomes very difficult, right? SLA monitoring. As a CCSP, you have to be ensured you have to be monitoring your cloud's vendor compliance with the SLAs, right? You have to make sure whatever SLAs are defined, they are being monitored. And communication. So managing a cloud vendor, it involves a whole new level of communication internally and externally. You have to make sure what your requirements are there, they're communicated, the cloud. And as a CCSP, you are like the go-between between your organization and the cloud provider from the security perspective. And these are the things, the contract management. I mean, these are all the things you have to understand, right? The definitions are there, metrics, access to data, performance. These are the things which have to be present in basically all the contracts which are there. Not going to get into too many details. These are pretty self-explanatory. Last one and the very last topic of the CCSP, very important, which is supply chain management. As much as I would like to say that everything you have is like kept with the cloud provider, that is not true. A lot of times you have a lot of dependencies externally and internally. Libraries are being used, softwares are being used, which you are not owned by you, and you are trusting them. And attackers are aware of this, and because of this, they can compromise. So many attacks have happened, like the Log4j and other ones. Attackers are aware that third-party dependencies are a blind spot. So instead of compromising the cloud provider, they compromise the third party and they use it to basically piggyback onto your organizations. And so when you talk about risk assessment, you have to assess your supply chain also. It's very important, and it's going to become more and more important as more attacks happen. Things like SolarWinds, Log4j, all of those things, you can read up how many supply chain attacks have happened. Okay, wow, guys, congratulations. So you have reached the end of Domain 6 and the end of this CSSPS course. Thank you for listening to me so long. I hope this was useful to you. Please, if it was, do like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't done already. Leave me a comment section. I'm going to try and do the CISSP next, but do let me know your comments.